We have an exciting panel coming up next as we're going to dive into our next session, focusing on the role of policymakers in driving the green transition here in the UK. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our distinguished panelists and panel of experts to join us here. We've got Georgia Gould, the leader of Camden Council, Shirley Rodriguez, Deputy Mayor of London, Robbie Macpherson, Senior Political Advisor at Uplift and Climate APPG Lead, Annabel Rice, Political Advisor at Green Alliance, Ton Langinian, Senior Policy Advisor for Climate and Energy Policy at the Tony Blair Institute. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate that you've made time to be with us here today. So I'm going to just kick off by asking you the questions, as I would like to go through all the questions that I've got here for you. Shirley, if I may, I would like to start off by asking you, in your experience overseeing global climate change grants, what strategies have you found most effective in driving sustainable initiatives at the city level?
Well, thank you for inviting me here, and that sort of partly refers to some of the work I did in my career working for a philanthropy, but also worked at various local authorities where we were doing grant giving. And I think the biggest thing is being really clear about the direction and the ambition. So getting leaders like Georgia or the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, being really clear about where we need to be and what the target is. So in London, it's a net zero London by 2030. Really ambitious, very tough, but it sets that, the marching orders essentially for all of us, not just the mayor, not just the boroughs, but individuals, businesses, and so on. And then looking, having set that strategy, then it's a whole host of things about, understanding where the issues are, whether it's where your emissions are or where the problems are, and then really diving in to understand where you can make the most impact and where you might start. And of course, that varies from city to city, local authority to local authority. We have different powers, different circumstances, different makeups. So you have to have a sort of broad strategy, but then fine-tune it. And then I think absolutely in parallel with all of, for all of this is really engaging the communities. This can't be a top-down, deliver it to people. It has to be with local people saying, what do they want? And then how do you help deliver that? And we're doing some of that. We could probably talk about that a little bit later, about some of the examples that we're doing in London. And then finally, a big part of that is communication. It's messaging and really getting the messaging out about why we need to do it, what help is available, what the benefits are. And then, just to flag as well, we've had a lot, and you've probably seen some of this, I think, with some of the policies here, but, globally, a lot of distrust and mistrust, disinformation and misinformation. So that's a sort of huge change over the last few years, and we're having to fight against that. So that sort of engaging with a whole range of stakeholders to really push this forward is absolutely key.
When we talk about the policy-making process, it's all about implementation and basically the practicality. Tone, in your work at the Tony Blair Institute, how do you translate net zero policy goals into practical and actionable strategies for policymakers?
Yeah, so at the Tony Blair Institute, what we do is that we work with leaders, so both in the UK but also across the world. And I think what's really interesting when it comes to kind of net zero goals is that, when you're a political leader, you have a number of different priorities on your list of things to do, and net zero and reducing emissions is only one of them. So what we often try to do is think about how you can link up those different ambitions with each other to kind of create synergies and create kind of incentives for acting on climate policy, which I think is a really important first step. And I think a good example of this is we do a lot of work with leaders in Africa, for instance, where development will be their top priority, rightly. So it's understanding, how you can then practically talk about renewables, for instance, as a means to further development. And in an African context, for instance, there are a huge amount of barriers to do that. So then you need to think very practically through, so what does that mean? How do you then get the investment into a solar project, for instance? How do you set up your energy market to enable that rather than enabling fossil fuels? And so it's kind of working through both the kind of high-level ambitions and then working through what that means practically and explain that clearly. And I think kind of thinking about that those high-level aims together is a really important kind of a first step to get to those practical solutions.
Absolutely, and at the same time, the cross-party collaboration, another important part of the policy-making process. And Robbie, as a senior political advisor, what strategies do you employ to foster cross-party collaboration and consensus on climate-related issues in Westminster?
Yeah, there's a really important few points here which I would just like to highlight to begin with, which is that the UK's political consensus on climate is definitely, in some ways, quite unique to this country. It is, unfortunately, in recent years under quite intense attack, and it is beginning to weaken, quite frankly. And thirdly, on a more positive side, I think there are many things that we can do to mend it. But if we just take a step back and look what the UK's political consensus has allowed us to achieve, it has allowed us to achieve huge legislative frameworks which have really been able to drive forward policy over the past decade or so, including the 2008 Climate Change Act, which was voted through under Ed Miliband and the Labour Party, which was really world-leading legislation, but made stronger by the Lib Dems and, yes, the Conservatives in opposition relating to the role of the CCC and the UK's emission reduction targets. Again, in 2019, Net Zero 2050, a huge consensual piece of legislation. And in 2019, at the general election, to top it off, 95% of voters told politicians by electing parties committed to 2050 net zero or sooner that this is something that matters to them. So I think that the consensus is strong in Westminster and across the country. But unfortunately, what we've seen is a weaponisation of climate policies, not least under this particular government, which is unfortunate, and that is really coming to a head in terms of my job in Westminster to bring people together around ambition on climate and nature, and I think that that is something that we need to combat. I think that the way you do that is you challenge the sceptics head on, you don't let them, run wild with this, quite frankly, disinformation and allow mistrust to become something that's sown. You provide an alternative vision, you paint what the future looks like, and you come up with deliverables to show how that policy can then be implemented. And you meet people where they're at, because I think that in terms of politicians, I mean, Deputy Mayor, you'll be able to speak on this, and Councillor Lord, much more than I, but a huge part of this is selling that back to the public and getting their buy-in. And unless voters want to see these policies, then politicians are stuck, outside the Atherton window, struggling to get the policies forward. So I think them three things are really important. But in my job, leading the all-party group on climate at Uplift, and previously working with Annabelle Works at Green Alliance, leading the all-party environment group, I think that rallying MPs together through roundtables, providing them access to high-profile speakers, getting them out of Westminster for a start, and showing them that actually the race to renewables is happening in Grimsby, it's happening in the North Sea. Homes are being insulated, and on the flip side, people are thirsty for this change, and bringing all of them things together, I think, is the types of strategies that I would suggest. But yeah, consensus is really important. And I think
Consensus, yes. So translating the net zero goals into policies, and then the collaboration, the cross-party collaboration and consensus. We earlier had a panel of COP28 outcomes, and we had the founder of C40. We did talk about the importance of course, policies and regulations. So on that, Annabelle, in your experience with C40 cities, what lessons have you learned about the effective governance mechanisms for accelerating urban climate action?
Yeah, firstly, I just want to say thanks so much for organising this panel, and the role of policymakers is so crucial, and I think, really important to highlight. And building on the consensus that's already building around here, I think that firstly I just wanted to say why cities are important in this debate, and I know I don't need to say this to many on the panel, but given that cities are responsible for something like, that they're responsible for a large amount of emissions, but they also house around 2/3 of the global population, they're going to be hotbeds for innovation, for solutions, and really they're where the rubber meets the road in terms of action on the ground. So as both, victims but also contributors to climate action, they're really uniquely placed to handle the crisis that we're facing. And then I wanted to discuss why governance is important, because I think many in this room, if you think of a climate solution, the first thing that comes to mind might not be governance, but really how a city or any government at any level is run is completely crucial to actually achieving the action that we need to see, and also the implementation that we've already discussed. In terms of my experience at C40, I was managing our climate budgeting work, which London is pioneering, and I'm a huge fan of. It's completely the gold standard for governance. But there are three really key things that I came across as key points for good governance. The first being the need for a real champion of a leader, and one who's able to paint that positive vision that Robbie was talking about earlier. I think part of the reason that we've got into the situation where climate change is becoming increasingly polarised in the populism that's building out inside and outside of the climate space, the way to combat that is really showing that acting on climate change is in the benefit of all of us, and there's a vision for a future that needs to be painted, and it's difficult to find leaders that are able to do that successfully at the moment, just because of the backlash that you can face from both the media but also certain areas of the public. So having that champion is so important, but it's even more important that that vision isn't just held with the leader. So whether it's a prime minister, whether it's a mayor, whoever it is, that vision for the future needs to be shared by every single member of staff, and that ranges from the interns to the managers to the senior managers. Everyone needs to know why the work that they're doing contributes to that overall objective. The second really crucial thing is the kind of horizontal mainstreaming of climate action. Climate change doesn't exist in a single department. It's so fragmented, it sits across every single area of our society, so ranging from education to transport to everything. But our governance currently isn't built to work that way. There's so many silos in government, and that's true at a city level, but it's also true at a national level, and there's many that are working really hard to fight this, but it's a continued battle, and the need for collaboration is really strong. And then there's that piece on vertical integration too, so thinking about how cities are able to interact with national governments and be able to really advocate and ask for the powers that they need to act on climate change, but also bringing in the public. I think we've seen so many examples of failed policies where the idea is good, but there's been no engagement with stakeholders, and that's why it fails. I think a really good example of that is the Green Home Scheme a few years ago at the national level, which failed because it was put together in a matter of mere weeks or months, and industry just wasn't prepared to deal with it. And if they had that level of engagement, I think we could have seen a really different outcome. So yeah, those would be the three really key points.
Thank you. We are at a stage in the human history that I think we need urgent action at every level of society, and that brings me to you, Councillor Georgia. As a local councillor and leader of Camden Council, tell us what initiatives have you spearheaded to tackle the climate crisis at the community level?
I think to your point, I think there's a lot of hope and action happening at the local level. We're not waiting for national government to act. We are taking action alongside our communities, and I think that sits in a number of different places. Like fundamentally, we need to as councils kind of lead ourselves in relation to the powers we have. So that's planning, it's our own estates. In Camden, we've reduced carbon in our estates by 63%. It's our transport leadership. We've trebled the amount of segregated cycle spaces in the borough. It's the work we're doing to decarbonise homes. So there's a whole kind of host of policies we can take. And climate has to be embedded in every decision, and we've changed our constitution to mean that every single decision the council takes, we have to consider the climate and ecological emergency. And then we have a really important role as leader of place and convener, so working with all the different partners in our place, businesses, communities, public sector, to make sure that they are working together to achieve our 2030 ambitions. And realising that we can't act alone, we've been creating new coalitions across the country. So I chair something called London Councils, which is all of the London boroughs working really closely with Shirley and the Mayor. And we've come together with the 12 biggest cities outside of London to start something called Free CI, which is a climate investment commission, which is essentially about trying to get the kind of trillions that are talked about at COP into real projects in communities. Because we've calculated for London and those 12 cities, there's a $206 billion gap to reach net zero. So there's the need is too much for the public sector to be able to deliver alone. So we're looking at new models to bring investment into our communities. But I think finally and most importantly, it's our role working alongside communities. And in Camden, we were the first council to run a citizens' assembly, and that had a really mixed range of people in there. But together, they were bolder than we would have ever been alone, and we are implementing the plan that they've set for us. And when people are facing a massive cost of living crisis, struggling to heat their homes, sometimes this feels like the less urgent crisis. So we have to recognise that tackling this is a social justice issue, and we need to focus our policies on those who need them the most. So when we retrofit homes, we actually take people out of fuel poverty and change lives, and we have to always balance those two things together.
That's amazing. I mean, engaging the community and public in those decision-making processes, and also part of that community is crucial. But I'm going to move on. I'm very keen on listening to you and hearing about all the fantastic successful stories that you have, the policies, the environmental policies and programs that you've implemented in London that could serve as a model for other cities around the world.
Yeah. Well, just as a precursor, I'm saying, we have slightly different powers to, say, New York City, who have huge powers over their buildings. They're able to do a lot on building retrofit and removing gas boilers, for example. We don't have those powers. So what we do is focus in London on the things that the mayor is able to control, so largely transport and planning, but then also a lot of work working local authorities and others, convening people to do things. So 3 examples. The first one, if you're in London, probably outside of London, you've probably heard of the ultra-low emission zone, which we expanded last August. And the reason I'm talking about that here is because the causes of air pollution are very similar to the causes of climate change, and the solutions are very similar as well. And the ultra-low emission zone has had a huge impact on reducing air pollution. We've had results for inner London, reduced it by half, taking off about 50,000 vehicles off the road already, so contributing to reducing carbon, and really driving people to think about their behaviour and use public transport more or use their cars less. There is a place for a car, but what we need, especially in a congested city like London, is less of that. And I'm on a commission, our Common Air, which is really looking to elevate the impact of air pollution. 7 million people around the world die from air pollution. It's one of the biggest risks, health risk factors, and yet it doesn't have the attention that climate has. And it's shocking that it does. And you've probably heard the story of Ella Adu Kisi-Debrah, a 9-year-old girl who died. She was the first person to have air pollution cited as her cause of death, and that's really driven Sadiq's work in London, really pushing that. And what we do then is integrate, as people have talked about, climate into all aspects that we're doing. So that's a big policy that we've done on air pollution. And we're cleaning up our air 5 times faster than national government is across the country because of those policies. The second area is development. So we have new development going up in London, and we have what we call the London Plan, which sort of governs the spatial development of the city, and we set standards. So we have set standards that are driving reductions in carbon emissions 50% beyond national building regulations. And by some quirk, we were able to set that policy even though government abandoned it for the rest of the country. So in London, we're really driving that. We're seeing developments coming across the city, which are really then not contributing to making the problem worse. And we are advocating, there's a consultation going on at the moment where government is talking about changing those standards, and we're arguing that the local authorities should be able to set those standards above the ones the government set. Otherwise, we will then never get to that 2030 target. So it's a huge difference, and that really does look at a whole range of issues, the London Plan. If you take a look at it, it's not just about reducing carbon, it's about how do you integrate nature into our buildings, how do we protect the green belt, how do we look at air quality, how do we use the circular economy and promote that as well. And then the third piece I just talk about is greening our infrastructure in London. So again, you know, that the climate emergency goes hand in hand with tackling the nature emergency, and also looking at social justice. And one of the big issues for Sadiq is how do we make sure that people have access to nature? We saw that during the pandemic where, you know, probably about half of Londoners who didn't have access to a private balcony or a garden were really just stuck wandering the streets. And, you know, and I think people really appreciated that nature. So what we're trying to do is make sure that nature is on more accessible, more on people's doorsteps, but also trying to protect the species that we have and reintroducing species. So you'll probably have heard about some of the beaver rewilding, reintroduction projects we have in London, which are phenomenal. And what has been so special about those is the communities that bring that together. It's a combination of local authorities, NGOs, local communities who are absolutely desperately protective of these species and want to make sure that they thrive. And it just inspires people, and it's very emotional when you use it, if you ever get the chance to be at one of those, because you can see how passionate people are. And that connection to nature really then drives, I think, other people's action on climate and other things. So those are just a few things. Do have a look at our website. We're coming up, you know, we'll be publishing some reports recently in a few weeks' time about some of our achievements as well, but there's lots out there. And we're always, I should say, that we're always happy to learn from other cities. You know, London hasn't got the monopoly on good practice, and through C40 cities, we've learned from other cities around the world, and they learn from us, and that's really a way to drive action across cities globally.
Collaboration in its true nature. That's amazing. And thank you so much for also addressing the air pollution issue. The new report is suggesting nearly 11 million premature deaths globally per year due to air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. And as you said, it's very important to focus on that, because I don't think we are aware of the huge impact it has on our health. And I'm not going to go into the details, but infertility, steel gas, and all those issues. So thank you so much for also mentioning that in answering your question. I'm going to now look at Tone, that balance that we need with all the recent crises. The economic growth is also an important issue that needs to be looked at. How do you think governments can effectively balance economic growth and environmental sustainability in their policy-making agendas, particularly in the post-pandemic recovery phase? I feel like we are still in that phase, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a really, really important point. It kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier about the fact that, you know, climate action is super important, but it exists in a number of other important goals for any government. And providing economic growth is absolutely key to kind of maintain, you know, prosperity, kind of living standards for people. And I think what's very interesting that's been happening is that we've kind of gone from a period where climate was seen as something that would be a negative impact on growth to being seen globally as something that will kind of spur growth. And I think what's really interesting is that, you know, you got about, I think Bloomberg recently announced that there had been like well over $1 trillion invested in clean technologies last year. And I think that speaks of the kind of movement of money into that, and the fact that kind of clean technologies is being seen as a kind of a way to growth and prosperity. And if you look at, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, they've gone ahead and, you know, have a very ambitious spending program, which is leading to huge job growth, new businesses, new opportunities for people across the country in a number of communities. And similar action is being taken in countries across the globe at the moment. And I think what's really important there, in particular as well, is the incredible power of clean technology. Because what we're essentially doing is that we are innovating to make clean technologies the cheaper, better option. That is a better option that will fuel economic growth and fuel cost reductions, to make it the better alternative for how we power, how we deal with our kind of how we drive economic growth for our societies. And I think policymakers have been incredibly key in achieving that. If you think about the UK, you know, the Contracts for Difference scheme is basically what's led to the rapid fall in the cost of offshore wind. Incentivizing those type of behaviors and that kind of innovation, it means that climate is now kind of interlinked with economic growth and prosperity. And I think the most important thing policymakers can do now to kind of keep linking those is thinking about how you create those right incentives to continue that kind of trend and continue the kind of trend of, you know, it's not more profitable or better to focus on fossil fuels. It's better to focus on green policies. And I think we're definitely moving there as a society, but we can certainly do more, in particular in the UK, I think.
Thank you. We did talk about increasing ambitions earlier and those ambitious targets. Robbie, I'm now going to touch on the social justice issue, a very important issue that needs to be addressed. So how do you navigate the political landscape to ensure that climate policies are not only ambitious, we all need that, but also socially just and equitable?
Yeah, exactly. I think that, you know, we need climate ambition, and we also need policies which can help alleviate the cost of living. I think 1.5 degrees over the past year, we have, you know, seen record temperature increases, and records been broken again. Year on year on year, we're seeing this trend. Meanwhile, what we're seeing is a cost of living crisis, which is absolutely battering households across the country. And so I think that on the positive side, the good news is that climate policies can be both ambitious towards decarbonisation, and they can also help to you know, bring us to a society that is not so impacted by the cost of living. And in terms of the political landscape, we talked about earlier sort of the consensus and the sort of increased disagreements that are happening between politicians in this area. And I think that, you know, on the one hand, in September last year, the Prime Minister stood outside Downing Street and said that he wants a more pragmatic, I think, proportionate and realistic approach to net zero and climate policy. Well, I would just say on that in 2013, I think, quote, the green crop was ditched, and we saw now and in the previous few years amidst the energy crisis what that impact had on households. So I think that that's a really good example of how, you know, we need to be more ambitious. Pragmatic, yes, to ensure that things can be delivered, but we can't lose that ambition because that also hurts households in the long run. And just another example, actually, of a policy, which I would like to talk about, if that's all right, that's going through Parliament right now is the Offshore Petroleum Licensing Bill. You might have heard of it as the sort of oil and gas bill, the bill that basically is set to mandate an annual licensing round of oil and gas developments in the North Sea. And the metric I think that the government said they would like to measure that by is its ability to protect jobs, enhance energy security, and drive forward climate action. And unfortunately, that fails on all three metrics. So in the past 10 years, which is not actually that funny, you know, the oil and gas industry have lost 200,000 jobs, or just over, despite hundreds of new drilling licenses. And so it's hard to see how, you know, endless exploration and developments of new oil and gas then leads to any kind of just transition which these workers desperately, quite frankly, need. You know, today there are 30,000 oil and gas workers in the oil and gas sector, a further 100,000 or just over supported by supply chain employment. And this particular legislation offers them nothing. On the energy security side, I would just say that North Sea oil, 80% of that is sent overseas and sold on the international market to the highest bidder, so it's not really doing anything for us in the UK. And that's what's majority left in the North Sea in the first place. And then in terms of gas, estimates show that new licensing between now and 2050 would only provide 103 days of gas, or 4 days of gas a year for the UK. So again, failing on energy security. And in terms of climate, well, I mean, I don't really need to tell this audience, but fossil fuels aren't going to take us towards our climate goals or help to build the future that we need. The UN Secretary General says that, the IEA says that, the IPC says that, the former energy minister who stood down from Parliament in protest over this bill also says that, and so do so many other people. So I think that, on the one hand, this pragmatic approach to net zero is damaging people, and this particular legislation definitely is. And I think that you touched on the Inflation Reduction Act. Though not perfect in its entirety, is a great example of how climate policies and social justice can occur and run parallel to each other. And yeah, I would just also finish by saying that if they're not, considered through a social justice lens and a climate ambition lens, and I think that we just get what happened in France. Well, just recently, they do it quite well, the French, don't they, in terms of protest. But, the Gilets Jaunes and the farmers up in arms, we can't afford that if we want policies to have longevity. And so people need to be considered, and climate assemblies are a really important tool to ensuring that people's voices can be heard in the policy debate. But I would just probably finish by, saying that.
Thank you, and thank you for saying that. People's voices need to be heard, and with that, I'm going to also just mention here that the voices of youth in climate change movement is also crucial. And Annabelle, with that, I'm going to ask you, how do you think international climate diplomacy should involve and represent the voices of young people? And we would love to, of course, hear about your work with the G7 Youth Engagement Group. Later on, we're going to have an activism panel as well with our wonderful young activists. So we're very much keen to hear from you. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for asking this question. I think it's so important to bring youth into a policy-making discussion. Just in terms of my background, it was 2 years ago now, I was selected as the youth delegate for climate to attend the Youth Engagement Group for the G7, which was an incredible experience, and I would absolutely encourage everyone to apply for it if you're under the age of 30, which I'm clinging on to for dear life. So yeah, it was an incredible experience, and I've also attended COPs in the past, and so have a few reflections on kind of what makes the difference between meaningful youth engagement and what otherwise might be seen as somewhat tokenism. I think the really crucial thing for me was that beyond just being provided the opportunity for young people to attend events, so it's amazing to speak at events, to attend COPs, to go to the G7, those are all really, really amazing opportunities. But what I found was really lacking was access to decision-making spaces. I think that was particularly true at COP, and again, I probably don't need to tell many in this room that by the time we get to a COP conference, there's been several conferences in the run-up. So there's subsidiary body conferences and a whole series of other events. And it's much more difficult for young people to get invited to those kind of conferences and to participate there. And yet those are where all the decisions are actually made. By the time we get to COP, yes, of course, there's a few really pivotal moments in there, really, really important for international diplomacy. But a lot of the basis for the decisions has already been made. And so if young people aren't included in the spaces where actual policy is being considered, I think that is a huge issue. And just going back to citizens' assemblies as well, which has already been mentioned, I think young people and people in general, when they attend citizens' panels, they consistently come up with more progressive policies, which just shows that there's such an appetite for action. I think the other thing to consider with young people is the kinds of people who are able to attend and be represented at these events. And that can just range from really basic logistics, like young people have school, or they might have university, or they may have other jobs as well. It's a huge time commitment to also try and be a policymaker in your spare time and often have no access to training. I mean, that's not something that's unique to young people, and I'm a member of the Future Leaders Network. And a study came out, I think it was last year, that 82% of people in management or leadership positions have never ever had management or leadership training. Which, I mean, some people might not find shocking in terms of like maybe you've had managers where that's definitely the case, but I think it's something that we really need to change, and that young people can't be expected to just go into these positions having no training, limited access, limited capacity, and be able to change the world. And the last thing I'll say is that there's a tendency, I think, to think of young people as this like really inspirational people who, whilst it may definitely be true, and I hope that it is true, it's not the only thing that they are, and it's not the only thing they should be considered to be. So we often have at COPs, a young person will come to the stage and give an amazing, rousing speech, and then they won't be allowed into the decision-making room. So kind of what was the point? That young people aren't there to sort of give you a boost so that you can then make great policy. They're there because they have amazing contributions and they have a different perspective on the world that needs to be represented in our policies, and particularly our climate policies, given that they'll be the ones inheriting a lot of the problems that we're facing and that we're causing. So yeah, those are the key takeaways for me.
That's wonderful, thank you. So rapid climate action, ambitious goals and policies, and that brings me to you with that, having that balance that is needed. Georgia, how do you balance the need for rapid climate action with the demands of local governance and community engagement? Sorry, it's a bit of a...
I think we've talked a bit about the power of citizens' assemblies, and I think the reason we did a climate citizens' assembly was because we're aware that this can be a space that's really contested, and in our assembly we have people who feel like Camden Council persecutes car users, and then people who think we should ban all cars, and every range of opinion in between. And we actually did a lot of work with schools before that, and they presented in to the assembly. And I think it's really important that people have a space to have that real dialogue across different. That in an assembly, people are paid for their time, and so it is, you kind of honour that time, and it means you have a much more diverse group of people than you would otherwise. And then they publicly came to a consensus, which actually was more ambitious than I think we probably would have been on our own, and because the evidence was presented to them, and the way that decision is made, I think, is really important. So there's a kind of legitimacy to our climate action plan because it has been written by citizens, and they also set up a climate panel that holds us to account as a council on delivering against those ambitions. And then I think it's just critical that in every way you kind of lead this work, that you do it alongside people and consider what the gains are. So one really good example is just around the corner from here. There was a kind of road that was not used well, just a bit of parking, kind of antisocial behaviour, and that has now been turned into a park, Alfred Place, if anyone wants to go and have a bit of lunch there. And seeing kids find that park, the community find it, the kind of joy that brings, it's a real gain from the change we're making, but it also helps climate resilience, tree planting and so on. So how do we ensure that things actually change for people and that they are part of the action themselves? And we've set up a number of kind of climate spaces where we're supporting community action, and we have young people who want to run clothes swaps, or people who want to run tree planting programs, or set up food co-ops, or things that are practical to lead change in their community. And I think supporting and getting behind that is so important, because often the energy and ideas is there. It just needs backing by councils and by government. But I think we can't hide from the fact that some of this is really hard and really contested, and there is a lot of money going into campaigns to against low traffic neighbourhoods, or ULEZ, or 15-minute cities, and it doesn't help when you have the government kind of trying to turn this into a culture war issue. And so I think it's really important that there is that we take the time to bring people with us, to go deep into communities, to work alongside people, so that we don't let this become a culture war issue, and we hold the community together, because most people really want to take action, but they just need the kind of forums and support.
Wonderful. Shirley, How do you envision leveraging your role as a Deputy Mayor of London to just further accelerate the city's transition to a greener and more sustainable future?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I was appointed by Sadiq as his Deputy Mayor, but, you know, my role really is just to work with people in London, so obviously the boroughs who are you know, the 33 boroughs who are the deliverers, you know, they're closest on the ground. So the sorts of things that we can do in London are really do the sort of convening we talked about, pilot things, set up the London-wide policy that, you know, in consultation with boroughs and others to take that forward. So that's one way. But I guess it's really using the role to advocate what London is doing, you know, and when I say London, I don't just mean by the Mayor of London, but, you know, our businesses, our communities, our local authorities, and really sort of set it out there as, you know, what could be done in the city. So one of the projects we're working with is Future Neighbourhoods 2030. So actually we've got two, one in Somerstown in Camden working with Georgia, and also one in Nottingdale in Kensington and Chelsea, where really you know, our role is really to say, you know, what do the communities want, and get them to, you know, and it was very much you bid and tell us what you want, but it's you bidding, not the local authority. It's got to come from the community, but obviously you have to work with the local authority because they're going to have to implement many of the things. And we've got these two amazing projects, very different in scope, but it is very much to the conversation we've just been having about you have to engage people and use their inspiration and their ambition to really drive and talk to their peers about this climate action thing is actually a health thing. You know, by looking at reducing car use and promoting walking and cycling, it's about cleaning up the air as well as climate change, but, you know, reducing that impact on our lungs and premature deaths and so on. It helps bring green jobs in. And what are green jobs? They're just jobs that are in these new industries, but they're better, high quality, better paid. So making it real, and I think those are the sorts of things you know, that my role is really about. And then internationally, it's about that race to the top, you know, so that competition. So when Sadiq is in a meeting with C40 mayors, you know, from Milan to Paris to New York to Freetown, you know, they all talk about what they're doing, and then they go back and say, why aren't we doing that? You know, why can't we do that better? So it's about making our city the best it can be, really understanding that interconnection between climate, social justice, the nature emergency, air pollution, you know, all of those things are absolutely integrated. But in the end, it's about the quality of people's lives, and that's really my role, is to advocate for that. So in any avenue that we can. So that's why I'm here, for example.
Well, absolutely. Best of luck with that. We are now going to open the floor for questions. Wow, we have five amazing experts on the panel. Too many questions. May I just please ask to keep the questions short and no statements. Thank you. The lady in the middle.
Hi. So, Annabelle, you mentioned how sometimes policymaking is such an exclusive world, especially to young people. So I was wondering if any of you have any advice for someone who wants to start looking at policy. Like, a lot of people say to go talk to the government and mitigate and talk and try to change the world. But how would you go about that? Is there a resource, a website, or something that introduces this policy world and this political world to non-political students or people?
Yeah, I have an initial reflection on that, but if anyone else wants to come in, feel free. I'm not being paid or anything, but you should go to the Future Leaders Network website. It's got some really amazing resources on it, which are basically just connecting young people with one another who want to make change. But also they run training classes for actually how you would physically do that and engage with policymakers, because, I mean, it's a set of skills like any other that you need a space to learn. And yeah, Future Leaders Network has some really amazing resources. I would also just say that it doesn't necessarily matter the kind of space that you're trying to policy make in. So wherever you work, there's an opportunity for climate action, sustainability. And so, you know, whether you work at like a cafe or whether you work at a bank or whatever it is, there's ways to get involved in sustainability. And I think that's becoming more and more true as the years go by, that there's often sustainability teams and things like that to get involved in. So I think start where you can and where you're at, but also try and build those skills, which I know is super annoying because it's another like commitment and something you have to do on the side. But yeah, it's so worth it, I promise.
Anyone
Can I
else?
just,
Yes,
yeah,
please.
I'm just going to give a shout out to another organisation called Hope for the Future, which is based in Sheffield but operates across the country. It's actually where I started working in sort of climate and political space. And Hope for the Future are really amazing in that they will work with anybody to essentially help them encourage their elected representatives at local and national level to take action on climate. So really getting into the how do you form an email? How do you present yourself in a meeting? How do you structure the conversation so that it leads to an outcome? And how do you, really get involved in that space? So I would definitely say that Hope for the Future are a resource that you should check out.
Yeah, and I'd just say, just to have a look at your local authorities or Transport for London or the GLA. You know, they often do sort of apprenticeships or internships or volunteer. You know, many of the the NGOs and organisations. That's really how you get a sense of what you might be interested in, whether it's communications or policy making. It's all part of the same push of trying to change policy and changing the world.
So many fantastic questions here. I'm just reading and it's just so difficult to choose from. But I'm going to ask you this. I think it's a very good question. I'm keen on knowing the answer from the wonderful panelists here. How do we engage the disengaged members of the community?
I think you start from where people are. So we have a number of missions that we have in Camden, and one of them is around our estates, our council estates. And often when you go in to talk to people, they're just really trying to make ends meet, worried about the cost of living crisis. At the moment, we have so many residents who are struggling to feed their family, and the climate crisis just seems like it's just not it's not the top of their priority. But actually, we can do work together on setting up a food cooperative, or we're setting up kind of sharing spaces on estates. Or in our libraries, we have a library of things where you don't have to buy a lawnmower, you can rent one. So how do we make people's lives easier, and how do we bring climate into the things that are important to people, like access to food and saving money at a time when people are facing huge challenges? And what we've seen is through that work, so many more people have kind of become engaged in the climate crisis, but it's not the place that we start with. We start with what's important to people.
Yes,
So,
please.
So, I mean, this is not to kind of question the premise of the question, but I don't actually think everyone needs to be engaged to achieve outcomes. Because I think, for instance, if you think about something like electric cars, which is a key part of the solution, what actually changed the dial on that was that Elon Musk, and this is not an endorsement of Elon Musk, came along, and the Tesla became this new cool thing that loads of people wanted. And it didn't really have anything to do with climate for most of those people, I think. It was just that electric vehicles became a cool, better option for them. And I think the more stuff like that we can find, and ways that we can make climate action almost something you don't even realize. So you don't have to be someone who's engaged in climate. It just happens. It's just something you want. Is a really important thing. And so as much as possible, if you can achieve that, you can also achieve more, and not have to do that really heavy community engagement all the time, which is of course super important, but it's another kind of tool, I think.
I like that. I always say make climate change sexy.
Yes.
Yeah, can I just make a really quick point of as much as I think that obviously engagement in climate is important, I think it's part of a much broader problem that people feel unengaged in politics more broadly. And I think that's part of the solution, is how do we rebuild democracy so that people feel like their engagement actually matters. And I think that that trickles down to then people being more engaged in climate, because they feel like if they are, that has influence. And I would also say that we need to remove the blame from individuals as well, because that's been such a tactic that's been employed by industry for so many years now. You know, the carbon footprint being made by BP, I think, says it all. It's by removing shame, people can feel like they can engage in wider climate solutions without saying, you know, I have to be perfect, or I have to be vegan, or I have to have an electric car. I don't think that we should have the focus be on what an individual can do, because the issue is so much wider.
was just going to add two really quick reflections, which is in terms of public engagement, I think that coming from sort of like a bubbly movement sector, I think remove the jargon, because like my mum does not know what net zero is. Like, I don't think that like she like has the time to think about that. Like, so many people have priorities other than climate and politics that they'd have to like contend with day to day to get by. And so meeting someone where they're at is really, really important. And the second point that I would add is mailbag politics, just to flip the script a little bit in terms of the disengaged policymakers and politicians in the community. I think that what we need in Parliament, and particularly as we're approaching an election season, is people to be engaged. So write to your MP and put it in their mailbox that this is something that matters to you, whether it's something specific or high level. Use organisations like Hope for the Future to navigate that quite complex and tricky and isolating sort of landscape. And particularly in the general election, make sure that your prospective parliamentary candidates know that you and your local community think that this is something that's important.
Can I, sorry, just to
Yes,
add
please.
something. I think one of the key things is making information and data available. So that allows people to understand what the issues are and what their issues are in their local communities, and then allows them to either take action like writing letters or actually mobilising themselves. So, you know, one of the big things we've done in London is Breathe London, which is basically real-time air quality monitors, and now, you know, communities can apply to put them in areas where they think, I think there's an air quality problem here, or I don't know if there is one, and then they realise there is one, and then they mobilise and say, I want a school street, Councillor Gould, and they're doing fantastic work in Camden, but lots of different things, and I think it's that actionable, giving people the ability to understand what the issues are and action them is really important as well.
Thank you. Many questions. The gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. I really enjoying the debate. I have to just confess to something. I just recently completed a master's here at UCL, which I found hugely invigorating, enormously stimulating, and deeply frustrating at the same time. Because I came away from that master's with more questions than answers, and you know, of course, that's the nature of education. But my question really here is ambition. That's the word we've used. Radical is the word that gets attached to ambition sometimes. And the thing that worries me, one of the things that worries me, is just how much we are all guilty of using the business as usual model, and how the thinking that we all partake in is supporting a broken capitalist model. You know, we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. We just can't. So my question is to put that in real, solid, hard context. We're trying to get to net zero. People don't understand what it is. They don't understand the benefits. To go back to one of the earlier speakers who was talking about break it down into simple messaging and benefits. So we've got people living in homes with fuel poverty, and they see, well, they don't see because they don't understand it, but they get stirred by negative stories of the marginal cost of electricity and gas. And the fundamental issue there is government doesn't seem to have ambition. And my question to you is, how can we make government have ambition to translate the market, the broken market model that doesn't allow, on a day when we generate 40% or 50% or 100% of our energy from renewables, which have no marginal cost, and that person, me, you, all of us, are paying a gas price, an electricity price which is pinned on an international price set in Amsterdam from an energy trading body that bears no relationship to the fact that that electricity costs nothing to generate. You know, we don't see that benefit. So how are we going to get to net zero until and unless we think outside that square and challenge government at local, national, and international level to break those kinds of broken models and make them transparent? Nice, easy question.
So, as a Labour politician on the panel, I'd say elect a different government, firstly. That would be a good start. And I think Labour in the manifesto are talking about GB Energy and a mission around clean energy. But I do think that the system we have at the moment is not just failing the planet, it's failing people. I've talked a lot about the kind of levels of inequality we see, the cost of living crisis. And so I absolutely agree, we need to see much more radical and fundamental change, because to get to 2030, we're 6 years away and we're still really far away, so we need to see faster change. And I think that we've got a toolkit. We talked about this is a kind of policy panel, and we've been increasingly in Camden investing in imagination, activism and training. So how do we actually imagine new systems rather than just tweak the ones that we have? And that is a completely different way for us to think as policymakers alongside our communities. And I agree that we need a different way of framing this issue, which doesn't just solve the climate crisis, but solves all the other kind of fundamental inequalities we face alongside it.
Yeah, I'd say similarly that, through C40s and other organisations we've been looking, the whole range of sort of different economic models we look at. But, the fact is we are in an economic model that we're having to work with. And so what we can do as cities, as local leaders, is say, despite the situation we're in, despite the government policy, we can go further and push that ambition. And that's something that happened when, in the States, when Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. Lots of others, states, cities and others just said, like, we're in, and they just carried on pushing those sort of policies that are really driving, and then with the basis of the sort of policies that Biden's brought in and the Inflation Reduction Act. In the UK, many cities are doing, I've talked a little bit about what we're doing in London, going beyond what national building regulations set. There are lots, the ultra-low emission zone going further despite opposition to those policies. You just need those leaders to keep pushing, I think, and then collectively that does start to move the needle. Is it fast enough? Probably not, but we've got to keep that movement going and, look for different leaders and different policies, I think, to keep pushing, but really bringing people along. And I think, all of this, absolutely radical policies, but need to bring people along. And if you turn people off, George has just said, if you're talking to people day to day who's saying, I can't afford to heat my home, I can't, we had a fuel poverty seminar at the GLA yesterday talking about how dire it is. We're going to have fuel poverty stats out later this week. I think it's about 13% of households in London face fuel poverty. So we've got to turn it to what can we do to help them in tackling the climate crisis, which is also around energy efficiency programs and raising, trying to get as much benefits, income maximisation and so on as well.
Could I just jump in with a really quick quote, which is also one of my friend Lauren, who's speaking on the next panel, which I hope you all stay around for. It's a joint favourite quote of ours, and it's by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who says that it's the dangerous radicals are those who are developing new fossil fuels. So don't ever let anyone tell you that you're radical for wanting renewables, warm homes, and a livable planet. So I would say that that's the kind of messaging that needs to get across to people. And then in terms of how does government do that, I think that through my lens is through more of a parliamentary lens, and I think that next week, I've already mentioned this, but the offshore petroleum licensing bill is something that we're going to be working on to amend and vote against, and I would encourage that you all, again, mailbag politics, write to your MP and tell them to do something about it as well, but we're running out of time, so...
Yeah, I just wanted to really quickly mention, I actually am the political lead for the Warm This Winter campaign, which is a group of 55 organisations across the UK, which are fuel poverty, anti-poverty and climate organisations, and it was founded under the acknowledgement that we have a completely broken energy system. And I think 6.5 million households are in fuel poverty right now. 2 million households had to turn off their fridge last year, which doesn't just have implications for food, but also people who had medicines such as insulin. There's a lot of different things that go into it. It is completely broken. I think that I don't see how we get to a different economic system without really investing in international spaces, because I think that the only way to move is collectively. And going institutions like C40, which connect different cities, but also I think with the UN, we haven't really mentioned here, but is a really important space. But the first thing is that we really need to detoxify the degrowth narrative, I think, particularly even with the public, where right now that just seems like a really scary thing.
Well, I'm going to head your question straight on. So in my view, it is absolutely impossible to both go for net zero and to overthrow capitalism at the same time. I don't think that is feasible, because what is really important with this is that we're operating both within a kind of policy sphere, but also a politics sphere, and you've got to marry these things up. And you were talking earlier about the beauty of net zero, which is that it's bringing together people from the Conservative Party, from the Labour Party, from all different sides of politics. You won't do that if we're going for some like really radical, crazy ideas. I do think you need radical policy, but it also needs to be practical. And I think this is why you can instead think about how do you reimagine the planning system to make it much easier to build things in this country, for instance. That's what's holding back at the moment from us having more renewables. And it's identifying those policies. And I think actually the energy market is a really good example of that. And the government has been consulting on the energy market. And I think that there are some really interesting new ideas on that. How do you structure that to make the benefits more tangible to people? And I think that is in that space of radical but practical. So I would recommend that you have a look at that consultation as well.
Thank you. I'm afraid that would be it. We are out of time, unfortunately. What an amazing conversation. Thank you all so much, Councillor Georgia Gould, Deputy Mayor Shirley Rodriguez, Robbie McPherson, Senior Political Advisor, Annabel Rice, Political Advisor, and Ton Longinian, Senior Policy Advisor. Thank you all so much for joining us.